long before energy drinks were slamming us with names like Monster Explosion or Guarana Overload, and before soda flavors began sounding like street racing teams, Peach Lightning, Cherry Voltage, there was Coca-Cola, the original, the cordial-looking brown elixir that began, as many legendary concoctions do, in a pharmacist's brass-plated daydream. It was 1886 in Atlanta, a city still shaking the soot of the Civil War out of its socks, trying to invent itself new. Among its many rebuilders, there was a mustachioed gentleman named John Stith Pemberton, who dabbled distantly in medicine, not unlike how a cat might dabble in shredded curtains. A wounded Confederate veteran, Pemberton was both entrepreneur and habitual tincture tinkerer. He had seen his share of battlefield trauma and perhaps a little too much morphine. And like many pharmacists of the 19th century, Pemberton held a reverence, bordering on spiritual, for an ingredient most modern listeners know for an entirely different reason: the coca leaf. Yes, that coca leaf. Shared by the indigenous peoples of the Andes for centuries, coca leaves were chewed at high altitudes to whisper a little stamina into tired bodies laced in wool. They were sacred, nourishing, and, when soaked in a bit of wine or tonic, crackling with possibility. European traders, as they were wont to do, snatched up coca with wide eyes and powdered fingers and sent it off to fame, fortune, and eventually to a certain soda bottle. Now, where most tellings might breeze past this part, glancing knowingly at the phrase secret ingredient while hurrying to the nerve-rattling rise of Coca-Cola itself, we shall linger. Not for scandal or thrill, mind you, but because the journey of Coca into the American soda stream reads much less like a gritty drug drama and much more like a sleepy heist comedy told by candlelight. You see, the importing of coca leaves into the United States was, curiously, never entirely secret. It was just quietly handled and conspicuously glossed over. In fact, the US government had a deal with a delightful-sounding place, the Maywood Chemical Works in New Jersey, a company that was officially licensed to import tons, yes, tons, of raw coca annually. But here's the twist with an exhaled sigh. Maywood wasn't destroying the cocaine on arrival. No, that would be terribly wasteful. Instead, Maywood was refining the leaves in a cozy, vanilla-scented arrangement with a pharmaceutical company, removing the active alkaloid, yes, you know which one, and tucking the leftover leaf, the spent leaf, as they called it, into a neat little shipment labeled Coca-Cola ingredient and sending it south to Georgia, like a quiet care package for capitalism. And who, you ask, did the heavy lifting? Who actually navigated the tons of daring red tape and sleepy chemical processing to make this happen? That would be the workers. Not the heroic kind that storm barricades or stare meaningfully into the distance with coal-dusted cheekbones. No, these were workers with quiet hands and stained lab aprons. People named Gerald or Eunice, who had strong coffee before measuring out soft heaps of dried coca into burlap sacks. People whose lunchboxes might contain thermoses with tomato soup and a folded napkin, even as they managed the country's invisible artery of a controversial stimulant. They operated in laboratories that smelled faintly of lemon soap and ammonia. They listened to toolboxes clank as the occasional pipe needed tightening. And some of them, perhaps too tired or too loyal or too sensible to gossip, understood exactly what they were handling, and politely never mentioned it outside of staff picnics. Officially, Coca-Cola hasn't contained actual cocaine for over a century. Sort of. Unsurprisingly, the specifics of how the decoconized coca extract is still made are, even now, veiled behind trademark locks, mutually beneficial nods, and a large, sleepy file cabinet somewhere in New Jersey that nobody's asked about in decades. Still, the ingredient known only as merchandise number 5 inches remains one of the company's most guarded secrets, less a dangerous mystery and more of a whisper beneath fluorescent lighting and impossibly crisp accounting. So the next time you sip a Coke and think you taste a hint of something floral, earthy, almost told in confidence, You just might be tasting the residue of sleepy chemists, gloriously boring government permits, and a ritual repeated quietly for more than 100 years. A secret passed hand to hand, like the recipe for a very naughty tea. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now that we've met the leaf and the laboratory, let's gently follow the trail into curious sea territory, where barrels wink quietly in customs, and one company uses an entire building to protect a formula no one's technically allowed to know. In the late 19th century, under the warm Georgian sun, a pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton was tinkering with something decidedly fizzy in his modest Atlanta backyard laboratory, part garden shed, part apothecary, part eccentric uncle's spice cabinet. Pemberton was a wounded Confederate veteran with a limp, a flair for chemistry, and a growing dependency on morphine after one too many saber duels at Antietam. Like many a Southern gentleman at the time, he sought not just relief from pain, but also a legacy, preferably one carbonated. Now you might think, as we all do eventually at bedtime, what would drive a man to combine coca leaves and cola nuts in a syrup that would go on to change the global soft drink game? The answer, as it often is, involved a dash of pain, a pinch of profit, and a generous scoop of 19th century lack of regulation. Pemberton's first version, known affectionately as Pemberton's French wine coca, was heavily inspired by a Parisian tonic named Vin Mariani, which had a cult following among Europe's most refined caffeine and cocaine enthusiasts. That wine was simply Bordeaux laced with coca extract, a beverage elegant enough to amuse Queen Victoria and punchy enough to make Thomas Edison stay awake for literal days. But in Pemberton's Georgia, things went sideways, or upwards and volatile. In 1886, the temperance movement, like an overzealous aunt at Thanksgiving dinner, decided alcohol was no longer welcome. Atlanta banned the sale of spirits, and in a country that invented the corn dog, this was a grim turn. With his French wine coca now on the municipal chopping block, Pemberton scrambled. He removed the wine and replaced it with sugar syrup and carbonation, giving the world what would eventually be known as Coca-Cola. It was still infused with coca extract, yes, that coca, but now it fizzed like a cheerful sneeze and tasted like something you could enjoy on a summer porch without confessing it to your pastor. But here's where the story starts to bubble in more interesting ways. You see, getting coca leaves to Atlanta in the late 1800s wasn't exactly as convenient as ordering groceries during a thunderstorm. The coca plant, a leafy green shrub with a scandalous secret, was native to South America. Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia mainly, where the high-altitude humid jungles coddled the plant like a beloved housecat. For centuries, indigenous people had chewed the leaves for energy, digestive relief, and, presumably, the strength to politely endure European colonizers. But turning those raw leaves into an ingredient safe for shipping halfway around the globe, that required some mild alchemy and a surprising amount of paperwork. Pemberton, and those who inherited the Coca-Cola recipe after his death in 1888, needed our consistent and secret stream of coca extract, but minus the elements that might make you dance on rooftops or try to invent jazz. The trick was to keep the flavor and toss the cocaine. By the early 1900s, a curious thing began to take shape. A cozy, hush-hush supply chain stretching from Andean highlands to northeastern American factories. At the far end, coca leaves were harvested by workers unknowingly feeding a soft drink empire. Some believed the leaves were for medicine, others for sacred use. Few, if any, imagined their efforts would one day help fuel international debates over soda school bans and the horrors of vending machines. From there, the leaves embarked on a surprisingly bureaucratic journey. They were dried, bundled, and shipped north like so many herbal pen pals, occasionally attracting the attentive noses of customs agents. But over time, a particular company based in Maywood, New Jersey, managed to secure the only special license in the United States to legally import coca leaves from South America. What they did next was, technically, they removed the active cocaine alkaloids from the leaves under strict government supervision. Technically, this company, the Stepan Company, evolved into the only legal cocaine processing facility in the United States, working under the ever-watchful eye of the DEA. Their job: strip out the illegal bits, preserve the flavor essence, and hand over that de-drugged syrup to Coca-Cola's secretive flavor vault, where it would join the other clandestine ingredients in the drink's fabled merchandise number 7. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, how exactly did all of this stay under wraps for so long? Patience. We are only just dipping our toes into this curious cola stream. The really secret part, that was happening quietly, almost invisibly, in the quiet shuffle of crates, the whisper of customs paperwork, and the clever hands of workers who knew far more than they let on. As Atlanta sipped, the sweet, fizzy mystery in elegant glasses, and the world slowly fell under the spell of the contoured bottle, a whole unseen network was stirring like bubbles in a chilled drink. And somewhere in New Jersey, a door was clicking shut each evening behind men and women who smiled like they knew something no one else did. But before we peek into those locked labs and silent shuffleboard shipments, we ought to make ourselves comfortable. We're just beginning to listen in on the whispers behind the fizz. Somewhere between the clinking glass of old apothecaries and the shuffling boots of delivery boys with secrets in their satchels, the coca leaf began its quiet, endless voyage into the legend of Coca-Cola. But unlike other ingredients, sugar, caramel, a whisper of vanilla, the coca leaf had to travel an especially peculiar road, draped in both mystery and legal paperwork that might as well have been written on parchment with a wink. You see, in the late 1800s, coca leaves weren't quite the international scandal they're associated with today. At that time, the coca plant, native to the Andean highlands, was a sort of botanical celebrity. It held the same allure that kale might hold for a modern-day juice enthusiast, only with a considerably stronger kick. People genuinely believed coca brewed health, vigor, and perhaps a refreshing walk up a small mountain. And thus began the strange, sleepy tale of how these whisper-soft green leaves made their way from sky-brushed Peruvian slopes to the bustling docks of the American East Coast, and eventually into Atlanta syrup vats. A small but curious company called Maywood Chemical Works, located in New Jersey, of all sensible places, emerged as a key player in this dance of discretion. Their specialty wasn't selling soda, nor were they peddlers of refreshment. No, Maywood had a different job. They were in the business of decoconizing, a term that sounds like a chore performed by monks with pestles, and patience. The process was something like polite alchemy. First, they imported enormous bales of raw, dried coca leaves, legally, of course, with permissions signed in triplicate and probably wax seals pressed just for flourish. Once they arrived, Maywood would set about removing the excitable bits, the active cocaine alkaloid, which, let's be honest, was the part that danced too freely at parties and was likely to be banned before dinner. After all, by the early 1900s, the United States was developing a suspicious eye toward anything too stimulating. National tastes were shifting from invigorating tincture of peppy to please no more seizures at lunch. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 arrived with a clipboard and a judgmental stare, and companies like Coca-Cola suddenly had to explain why there was a pinch, okay, maybe a spoonful, of cocaine in their soda. To stay a few frothy steps ahead of the law, root and branch changes began behind the scenes. Coca-Cola turned not to some hand-wringing committee, but to the efficient secrecy of Maywood Chemical, who could extract the dangerous bits and leave behind the minty fresh. This is definitely still a health tonic flavor of the leaf. Now, here's where the story gets a bit dreamy and strangely bureaucratic. Because while Maywood removed the narcotic, they didn't throw that part away. Oh no. Waste not. Want not. especially when the US government itself had growing needs for controlled substances applied very, very precisely. So the cocaine, the powdered ghost of the leaf, was rerouted under licenses to pharmaceutical companies. Some of it was also held in reserve, a phrase that makes it sound like it's sipping tea in a quiet corner, holding a passport. Coca-Cola, for its part, received the now placid leaves, calm and sober, but still bearing that distinctive fragrance, like chewing a mint leaf in the Andes after a good nap. These decoconized leaves were then used to flavor the syrup. They were the silent muse, the earthy foundation beneath the sugary fizz. If Coca-Cola were a jazz quartet, the coca leaf was the bassist. Yet telling this story openly was not encouraged. You wouldn't find Coca-Cola advertising their connection to Maywood Chemical Works on the side of delivery wagons. In fact, the entire process was wrapped in such a patented cloak of confidentiality that for decades, hardly anyone outside of a few dusty offices knew how the coca leaf was still, legally, making it into the soda. So while the world sipped happily from bottles of bubbling pause and refresh, behind the curtain danced a quiet, logistical ballet. Peruvian farmers harvesting alkaline treasure, chemical technicians in lab coats who probably slept very little, and legal teams with more red tape than a holiday department store. As evening turns softer still, and our story leans gently into further secrets, we follow the journey of a single, sleepy leaf, from high valleys to ink-stamped customs documents, into crates, round steaming vats, and finally, quite deliciously, into legend. In the low golden light of late 19th century Atlanta, when carriages clattered politely over pebbled streets and corsets were still considered cutting-edge compression gear, a curious new tonic was being hand-dispensed at the counter of Jacob's Pharmacy. The man behind the counter wore a pince-nez so dusty it looked like it had fallen asleep mid-blink. His name was John Pemberton, a man who walked with a bit of a limp and mixed his drinks with the passion of a chemist exiled from the world of polite drinks, which, funnily enough, he was. Now, a little behind the drapes context, John Pemberton had been a Confederate veteran, a pharmacist by trade, and, like many war-scarred veterans of his time, an enthusiastic connoisseur of homemade medicinal experiments. After recovering from a saber wound that would make most people swear off fencing, for life, he developed a worrying relationship with morphine, which meant he was also on the lifelong lookout for a more socially acceptable alternative. Hence, his latest creation, a strange combination of sugar syrup, soda water, wine, until Atlanta cracked down on that, and, whisper it, softly, the leaf of the coca plant. Now, before your imagination scampers too far ahead, let's gently place ourselves in the mindset of the era. Cocaine wasn't yet the nervous headline act it would grow into. In 1886, it was more like the oat milk of its day, promising, fashionable, and entirely misunderstood. To Pemberton, coca offered exactly what Victorian society secretly craved, a cheerful, legal pick-me-up without quite understanding just how perky things could get. But here's where the bubbles rise to the story's surface. Although Pemberton mixed the initial syrup himself, this wasn't a one-man show for long. The biggest secret of all was how the coca itself, those soft, near waxy, slightly minty scented leaves grown high in the Andes, made it to American shores in the first place. You couldn't just order a crate on Victorian Amazon, nor would your local wholesaler be thrilled if you strolled in requesting a bale of stimulant foliage. Enter the shadowy ballet of international supply. Coca leaves were being harvested mostly in Peru and Bolivia, usually by indigenous workers who probably had no idea their hand-plucked greenery was destined to fizz in southern soda fountains. These cultivators carried on a tradition thousands of years old, chewing coca while working, walking, or presumably wondering just how strange gringos could be. Once harvested, the leaves were carefully packed, dried, and loaded into burlap sacks with a reverence that made them look more like sacred tea than a soon-to-be sweetener. They began their long, secretive journey north, first by mule, then by ship, and eventually into the shadowy custody of men with woolen, suits and serious expressions. Men who worked under cover of night, or at least under the cover of plausible deniability. Because by now, American customs agents were beginning to catch the scent of something a little zippy. To maintain a tidy reputation, people like Pemberton had to source their samples through importers who knew how to navigate increasingly fussy regulations. Many of these middlemen operated out of New York City, the great bustling edge-of-the-century soup pot, where cargo ships chugged in from every continent, and the docks echoed with accented shouting and the clink of crates holding everything from mangoes to imagined miracles. It was in New York that one of the oddest chapters of this sleepy saga took root, where a particular company, a rather prim-sounding outfit named Maywood Chemical Works, began quietly importing coca leaves officially for medical use. Though medicine, as you might guess, was a pretty flexible term, especially after a martini or chitu. Maywood's future role in this tale will require a deeper descent, but for now, imagine those crisp leaves rolling gracefully off the ships, disguised among legitimate cargo, guava, guano, guacamole mix, probably, all watched over by workers with neither the time nor the inclination to question why a shipment of herbal tea required a sealed manifest and faintly glowing night guards. Meanwhile, down in Atlanta, Pemberton was dealing with a different problem. His original alcoholic coca wine had run afoul of Georgia's anti-booze laws, meaning he'd have to pivot to something tamer, bubblier, and less legally questionable, at least on top of the table. And so, while the leaves continued their clandestine voyage into southern chemistry sets, a new version of the drink was born. A fizzy syrup with a touch of caramel color, a giddy pinch of cola nut for energy, and just enough coca to purport health benefits without inviting too many questions. Or so they hoped. But how do you turn a secret ingredient into an empire-sized business when the ingredient itself is technically, let's say, ambitious? That gentle swirl of intrigue is waiting patiently in the next quiet corner of our tale, deep in the foothills of the Andes, where clouds taste the lavender-colored edges of mountaintops and birds argue melodiously over who sang it better. A curious relationship was quietly flourishing, partway between a handshake and an international wink. It was the late 19th century, and somewhere amid trackless sun-dappled fields in Peru and Bolivia, small coca farms began humming not just with bees, but with secrets. Now, by this time, North Americans were beginning to develop a very specific taste, not for Peruvian flute music, though that too has its moments. No, this taste was for that bracing, peppy kick that seemed to sneak, ever so tap-dancingly, into certain elixirs. Coca-Cola, at this point in history, was still an embryonic idea keeping a chemist named John Pemberton up at night, both figuratively and literally, because he too had recently sampled his own, let's say, inspired tonics. You see, coca leaves, those glossy, vivid green whispers of mountain vitality, held a chemical compound that was beginning to attract the curious attention of pharmacists and society ladies alike. That compound resided somewhere between invigorating and enthusiastically illegal, depending on the century you were in. But during the cheerful haze of the 1880s, coca's controversial potential was still neatly tucked under a doily of respectability. Back in South America, farmers referred to the leaf as the gift of the gods, and their relationship with it stretched back millennia. In fact, the Inca used coca leaves to converse with the divine, chew through cold mountain air, and endure multi-hour ceremonies that, in today's world, would be compared only to DMV line waits with added chanting. The leaf was sacred. But now, it had a new admirer, one who preferred to use it in dosed liquid sips, often served over chipped ice, and Victorian optimism. Enter the quietly competent and entirely unglamorous network of exporters, traders, and, yes, workers willing to navigate this strange little transnational courtship. The world was becoming connected by steam power and polite paperwork. In dusty offices somewhere behind the docks of Lima, tidy men in starched collars filed export permits and wiped their foreheads with the urgent grace of people shipping psychoactive plants under the gaze of governments who hadn't quite decided what to do about it just yet. In those days, crates marked ambiguously as herbal teas or botanical specimens left Andean highlands in the company of traders who could smile innocently while saying aromatic leaves with an entirely straight face. These were not cartels. These were not empire builders. They were quiet logisticians with ink-stained fingers and encyclopedic knowledge of ship schedules. They had names like Ernesto or Guillermo, and they wouldn't say smuggling so much as facilitated distribution with poetic interpretation. And that's just how coca leaves, many of which were destined to be macerated, cozily steeped, and refined into something once blended into tonics like Vin Mariani, and eventually Coca-Cola, found their way to the United States. They slipped across oceans, inside barrels scented with eucalyptus to throw off any suspicious sniffers. Occasionally, a nosy customs officer would tug at a label and squint before deciding, with diplomatic squishiness, that it was probably nothing urgent. Meanwhile, chemists stateside, many of whom wore pince-nez spectacles and smiled far too eagerly at bubbling liquids, were evolving the process for extracting the essence of coca, which wasn't always as precise as one might prefer, from an industry involving literal brain stimulants. It was all done in the name of science and capitalism, of course. And in dimly lit labs, the line between inspiration and unintentional insomnia was walked very, very loosely. Most people never knew the journey of those green leaves or the hands that picked them under the sunlight, their stories folded between fog and folklore. Workers in the Andes, padding barefoot over dirt trails, sometimes laughed at the thought of their harvests ending up in American soda fountains. The idea was surreal, even mystical. Yet somewhere across the globe, dandily dressed soda jerks were plonking glasses down onto marble counters, never wondering how a soft drink could make you feel like dancing with electricity. And all the while, tucked between mountains and myths, coca fields swayed softly in the breeze, blissfully unaware that they'd just become part of one of the oddest product ingredient tales in beverage history. Next, we drift closer to a man with a chemist's smirk and a saber scar, not necessarily related, who would bring a pharmacist's dream bubbling into a national obsession. If you were strolling through Atlanta in the 1890s, perhaps under the shade of a creaky parasol and with a gingerly clutched pocket watch, you might catch the fragrance of something more mysterious than magnolia blossoms and streetcar soot. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, like a whisper passed between hot bricks. But if you followed your nose and the vague hum of entrepreneurial secrets, you might arrive at a peculiar little building nestled near Edgewood Avenue, where soft sun filtered through warped glass and the real magic of Coca-Cola began to take root. Now, if you'd knocked politely on the window pane and peeked inside, you wouldn't have seen much to raise your suspicions. Perhaps a few barrel-chested men hauling wooden crates, or a wiry clerk dusting off an adding machine with the elegance of a man trying not to sneeze. But behind this curtain of normalcy, something altogether more thrilling was happening. The secret dances of the ingredient suppliers. Yes, the ingredient. Capital W. An open secret so quiet and controversial, it might have blushed if it could. Let us introduce the quiet heroes of this clandestine supply chain. They were not, as you might expect, villainous pharmacists in black cloaks or monocled villains twirling their mustaches. No, they were more like sleepy librarians with suspiciously well-funded travel habits and a few too many locks on their office drawers. These were the men responsible for securing, processing, and delivering the most sensitive item in Coca-Cola's formula, the coca leaf. Now, before you dash off into dreams filled with powdery white mountains and jazz-age speakeasies, recall that the coca leaf, in its raw state, is not cocaine. Not exactly. Rather like onions before the soup, or mischief before it becomes scandal, it required a bit of processing. And in the gentle hum of the late 1800s industry, processing wasn't done with subtlety. It was done with boiling vats, hissing stills, and an alchemy of anxiety and improvisation. Enter stage left, the Maywood Chemical Works. A small operation in New Jersey, a place otherwise known for its excellent diners and confusing turnpikes, Maywood was one of the few legitimate businesses with a government license to import coca leaves for medicinal and flavoring purposes. These labels, of course, were treated with the same respectful ambiguity as a Victorian aunt's nerve tonic. Maywood didn't just import the leaves, they refined them under what one might call selectively watchful eyes. Government agents technically monitored every shipment, but given the governmental record-keeping at the time was done with inkwells, ledger books, and the occasional nap, it's safe to say things occasionally slipped through the red tape like a buttered eel. A key cog in this quite literally buzzing machine was a man named Alfred. No last name, required as he preferred to operate much like a garden gnome, quiet, slightly unsettling, and best left undisturbed. Alfred's job was to receive the coca shipments from Peru, inspect them to make sure they were sufficiently leafy, and coordinate their next journey in the most nondescript brown paper packages the postal service could carry. The leaves, once deemed acceptable in their crackly, dried form, underwent a process called decocainization, another ambitious word used to suggest that somehow the cocaine was politely shown the door, and perhaps relocated to a less public ingredient list in a more secure drawer. To be precise, by the early 1900s, the United States government had gotten a bit twitchy about narcotics popping up in children's refreshments. So, the formula was adjusted, the cocaine officially removed, and what remained was called Merchandise Number 5, a hush-hush blend of decocainized coca leaf extract used purely for its flavor. You know, like how one might enjoy the scent of a thunderstorm, but not the electrocution. Alfred and his small squad of mustachioed chemists packed this extract tightly into little glass containers and shipped them, quietly, to Atlanta. No labels, no branding, just an understanding as silent as a butler at midnight. Back in Atlanta, contained within a sleepy factory that always seemed one cup of tea away from crumbling, these vials would be ceremoniously, if sleepily, added to Coca-Cola's syrup base. A few drops of Merchandise Number 5, a swirl of caramel color, a crunch of sugar, and voila, the perfect balance of zest, mystique, and just enough plausible deniability. And so it was. While polite society imagined Coca-Cola as a simple fizzy libation for an honest day's thirst, behind the roasted peanut stands and soda fountains, quiet deals and careful formulas kept the true flavor alive. But how does a beverage guarded by railroad tycoons, secret chemists, and a possible gnome go from chemists' dream to mass-market miracle? Let's take a slow, carbonated sip into that next. As the sun rose over the port cities of the Caribbean in the late 1800s, another kind of commerce stirred before the shops even opened. One wrapped in woven baskets, bundled in muslin sacks, and disguised cleverly as all sorts of respectable-sounding imports. Among the ordinary bundles of cacao, spices, and rum nestled a leaf, a very special leaf. A whisper of green with a whisper of scandal, coca leaves made their slow, sleepy crawl from the steep valleys of the Andes down to the loading docks of the Atlantic world. But here's where history takes a delightful nap inside a crate labeled herbal tea samples. You see, back in the maze of international trade, when customs inspections involved little more than tipping a hat and tapping a clipboard, paperwork was a polite fiction. Coca leaves were technically barred, or at least frowned upon by more upright authorities. But paperwork, well, paperwork said they were tea, or sometimes just botanical matter. And so these leafy bundles sailed placidly across oceans aboard merchant steamers named things like the SS, Stalwart Eagle, captained by men who asked few questions and wore very large hats. And on the receiving side, in places like New Orleans and New York, a scattering of commercial chemists and syrup makers waited eagerly, not unlike children awaiting a long-anticipated letter from Santa Claus or a crate of powdered sugar with, let's call them, enhancements. The coca leaf was no ordinary herb. It had illustrious beginnings in the high altitudes, revered by the Incan elite, and chewed by workers who scaled mountains with terrifying cheerfulness and unsettling stamina. Where better to borrow an ingredient than from a people who jogged up cliffs for fun? And now, in late 19th century America, it was being dried, ground, and turned into extract by men with waxed mustaches and questionable lab ventilation. But how did the prized Peruvian coca leaf find its way into the production lines of cola companies without causing full-blown diplomatic incidents? Well, there lies the genius not of shipping magnates or chemists, but of the people we'll call resourceful intermediaries. One such intermediary, known in scarce ledgers and the occasional bar ledger only as Uncle Dan, operated from an unassuming storefront, apothecary on top, shipping depot below, and secret coca drying operations somewhere in between. Uncle Dan had a philosophy. If the leaf arrived before breakfast, it could be syrup by sundown. And dinner naturally came with a bit of sparkle. With practiced discretion, Uncle Dan and others like him dried and processed the leaves into a thick, aromatic paste, what they called coca extract. It had a floral edge, a kick of bitter zest, and, notably, a chemical spirit that provided what early marketing called invigoration, and later epidemiology labeled, wow, that's cocaine. But back in those gentler years, the soda fountain was a haven of health tonics, and anything that promised longevity, alertness, and a reliable afternoon buzz was welcomed warmly, provided it came in a nice glass bottle and didn't talk too much about its origins. In the production halls of early Coca-Cola, where brass fixtures gleamed and the syrup ran deep, these quiet shipments would be added, ceremoniously but discreetly, always during off hours, often with the blinds drawn. Workers were told to label the barrels euphemistically, ingredient number 7, botanical energizer, or once, quite poetically, sunbeam powder. Everyone knew what it was, but no one said it out loud. Saying it might give it shape, might make it real. And of course, strange things grew popular in these syrup dens, tasting meetings where managers grew remarkably cheerful, deliveries at midnight that vanished by morning, and a general optimism that made executives believe they could take on Coca-Cola's biggest competitors, actual pharmacists, caffeine merchants, and a growing industry of patent medicine hucksters with elixirs that claim to cure anything from melancholia to inconvenient shyness. Still, in these fumbling early days of carbonated empire building, one thing was ever constant: the need for more coca, more leaves, more extract, and more discretion. And behind it all, an almost whimsical supply chain, powered not by efficiency or modern logistics, but by friendship, muffled winks, and whatever could be safely hidden under layers of lavender-scented packing straw. But as word of this invigorating syrup spread, tickling the attention of journalists, prohibitionists, and curious widows with a talent for sniffing out scandal, the discreet distribution of coca would need a little rerouting, or rather, even deeper secrets. Let's float there next, into the shadows behind the factory doors, where the real recipe evolved, not in test tubes, but in whispers. By the time the 1910s rolled across the American consciousness like a mustachioed bicycle messenger delivering telegrams and tuberculosis in equal measure, Coca-Cola was less of a beverage and more of a national ritual. The drink had made its way from southern pharmacy counters into saloon alternatives, soda fountains, and even the glove compartments of Ford Model Ts, by which we mean into tin cups balanced rather precariously on knee-height dashboards. Safety standards weren't quite a thing yet. Neither were cup holders. But for all its bubbly charm and fizzy societies, Coca-Cola had one rather buzzy secret. Its signature ingredient was still traveling thousands of miles to America in thick burlap sacks, under murky definitions and murkier intentions. That's right, the coca leaf. Not some abstract citrus extract or a whisper of caramel, but real South American coca, tap-tapping its botanical tambourine from the highland slopes of Peru and Bolivia into the dark magician's hat of industrial American chemistry. Now official channels claim that the coca, imported by the Coca-Cola Company, through its rather ominous-sounding associate, the Maywood Chemical Works of New Jersey, was stripped of its alkaloid, that is, the cocaine part. This was technically true, eventually, but things were a bit more nuanced at the docks. Let's set our scene along the New Jersey waterfront, where the docks jolted into the murky water like crooked piano keys. creaking as longshoremen moved between crates, barrels, and a lingering aroma of oil, fish, and mystery. It is here that deliveries bound for Maywood Chemical Works first touched American soil. Delicately, quietly, and often after dark. At the time, coca leaves were not outlawed. Not yet. But the federal government, in all its sleepless bureaucracy, had begun its slow-motion process of scrutinizing all substances that humans found even mildly enjoyable. To keep things efficient, a favorite euphemism of the era, customs officials often skimmed over crates labeled like innocuous ingredients, botanical leaves, South American origin, for medicinal flavoring. That medicinal flavoring being, of course, the condensed essence of late-night energy and questionable decisions. But crack open such a crate at the right moment, perhaps during a lunch break or while tugging at a stubborn nail with a crowbar, and you'd expose not bottles or powders, but sack after sack of dried green leaves, each one like a brittle memory from the Andes. According to whispered lore, there was a certain dock worker known as Sal Don't Ask McGinty, who took it upon himself to test the integrity of every fourth sack, by which he meant sliding his calloused hand into the leaves, plucking out a pinch, and popping it into the corner of his cheek like a misplaced chaw of tobacco. If his left eye began to twitch after 15 minutes, it passed quality control. Needless to say, the union had no official stance on coca leaf tasting. Meanwhile, the unspoken heroes of smuggling logistics, accountants, were hard at work disguising shipments under a polite fog of paperwork. One notable invoice simply listed agricultural dust meal as its cargo, which sounded sufficiently dull to evade inspection and perhaps even dissuade conversation. From the docks, the leaves were shuttled by boxcar or barrel-laden truck to the gates of Maywood Chemical Works, a facility so deeply industrial it looked as though it had been assembled with soot and an argument. Inside, chemists labored under Art Deco light fixtures, surrounded by beakers, rubber tubing, and the ever-present scent of chemical ambition. The trick was as elegant as it was clandestine. The chemist would decocanize the coca leaves, soaking, distilling, and finally neutralizing the active alkaloids before sending the flavor essence to the Coca-Cola company down in Georgia. The leftover is ace. Cocaine. Oh yes, we mustn't forget the leftover cocaine was, in theory, locked up, handed over to pharmaceutical companies, or incinerated. Theory being the operative word. Despite best intentions, or perhaps precisely because of loose definitions, people along every step of the process sometimes found themselves with souvenirs. A little residue here, a misfiled crate there. As one unnamed guard reportedly told his nephew, the smell in that room could keep a church choir awake until Judgment Day. And yet, the whole operation ran like a Victorian pocket watch, quietly ticking beneath a layer of respectability, commerce, and soda pop. So how did doctors' offices, leaf chemists, import papers, and underpaid dock workers all work together to safeguard the Coca-Cola formula? Well, as fate would have it, the answer involves government agents, a secret vault, and one suspicious janitor with incredibly clean floors. In the hushed shuffle of early 1900s, Savannah, Georgia, a city that always seems to be exhaling a slow sigh of humidity and moss-draped mystery, a curious man named John Pemberton Jr., no relation to the original Pemberton, and yes, very vexed by this fact, was keeping a rather unusual notebook. It was bound in old leather, smelled faintly of violet cologne, and contained, page by page, what he cheerfully referred to as the invisible ledger. Unlike most ledgers of the time, which tallied things like bales of cotton or train schedules susceptible to sabotage by raccoons, this one documented something much more delicate, subtleties of supply chains, specifically the hush-hush movements of coca leaf shipments destined for you-know-who. Now before you imagine a flurry of cloak-and-dagger action, complete with coded telegrams and secret knocks, this was less James Bond and more a sleepy game of Victorian telephone. The operation ran on euphemisms, polite winks, and the reliable southern tactic of making everything seemed so boring that nobody worth worrying about wanted to ask questions. At the heart of the operation was Weaver's Herbal Imports, which, despite its folksy name, was run by a consortium of very unfolksy chemists and quiet men who wore spectacles and not smiles. Hidden in the back room, behind shelves of dried lavender and the faintly menacing whiff of licorice root, was a modest workstation where an almost imperceptible process took place. And herein lies the secret. These workers never, ever acknowledged what they were actually handling. Historians would later call it administrative dancing, a series of sidesteps so practiced that nobody ever quite touched the truth. To the outside world, it was all just Peruvian botanical resupplies or Andean therapeutic flora. You see, the word coca was as welcome in polite society as a squirrel at a baptism. The leaf shipments arrived in utterly unremarkable wooden crates, nailed shut with a despairing slowness. They passed through customs with accompanying paperwork that listed them as medico-culinary grade foliage, which somehow sounded less suspicious than it should have. No one investigated. One customs officer, when asked about the crates, said cheerfully, "Well, I don't know. They smelled like tea and Protestantism." Meanwhile, inside, the workers at Weaver's would don their white aprons and begin the sorting. The leaves were gently sifted, dried further if necessary, and carefully transferred to labeled sacks that bore no more damning a name than Herbal Blend Number 14. Each worker operated with a peculiar reverence, like sorting relics from a saint's sock drawer. They never spoke of where the sacks went once they left the building, but everyone understood that a quiet man in a bowler hat would appear on alternate Thursdays, carrying a battered briefcase with mysterious compartments and a fondness for lemon sweets. He would hand over an envelope, tip his hat, and disappear into Savannah's vague, cinnamon-smelling fog. It's worth noting that all of this was entirely legal. Technically, in the winding, poetic way of early 20th century law, coca leaves were not considered the real problem yet. It was the isolated alkaloids and ungraceful overindulgence that caused eyebrows to rise and monocles to drop. But the raw leaf, that was, at the time, still romanticized, linked, perhaps optimistically, to tales of Andean altitude and mystical mountain meditations. So the workers pressed on, day after day, in their sleepy heroics. At lunch, they spoke of weather and pie. Never the leaves, never the man in the bowler. If anyone seemed too curious, they'd offer them a cup of botanical wellness tea, the blend made from the leaf leftovers and possessing just enough mystery to stifle further questions. Of course, not everyone could be trusted. Rumors, as they always do, began to waft through the alleys of Savannah like the scent of warm bread. One elderly pharmacist named Lydia even claimed she'd seen a crate stamped with a secret logo. EMC, she whispered ominously, though nobody else ever found proof. Lydia did enjoy exaggerating, particularly after a glass of Madeira and her nightly dose of laudanum. But the workers at Weaver's kept their silence and their rituals, and in the mild, leathery stillness of those back rooms, they moved hundreds of pounds of botanical leaves under the sleepy noses of the public. All of it destined, ultimately, for careful processing, decocainization, or not, and a fizzy little beverage whose formula was known only to a few and whose flavor hinted at secrets none of us were supposed to notice. As twilight deepened over Savannah and the moss swayed just slightly in the breeze, a different man, hundreds of miles north, studied a crate that had just arrived under far less discreet circumstances. He wore shoes slightly too shiny for his own good and hummed an off-key version of Camptown Races as he pried the lid open, with a crowbar and a conspiratorial grin. But that, I'm afraid, is another evening story yet to drift in. As the year turned its collar up against the chill of 1903, a curious correspondence fluttered through the US postal system like a slightly guilty sparrow. It was folded neatly in a brown envelope, smelled unmistakably of tobacco and ink, and was addressed with impeccable penmanship to a Brooklyn warehouse that, if you looked at it too long, felt like it was pretending to be far more innocent than it truly was. Inside the envelope was not a letter of love, nor a bill, nor an advertisement for the latest hair tonics. Instead, it was something altogether more entertaining, a coded invoice for a shipment of what the Coca-Cola company still only referred to delicately as merchandise number 5. You see, by this time Coca-Cola had entered a phase in its relationship with coca leaves, much like an aristocrat with a terribly exciting past. They weren't ready to sever it completely, but they were doing everything they could to make the whole thing look respectable. In theory, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act loomed on the horizon like a prim aunt at a wedding where the punch had been spiked. Official eyes were beginning to rove suspiciously over anything that reeked faintly of alkaloids or unlicensed euphoria. But in makeshift labs above soda fountains, in back rooms that smelled like a cross between a pharmacy and an apothecary's midlife crisis, a quiet industry had become astonishingly good at filtering the active cocaine out of coca leaves while capturing what was delightfully referred to as their flavor essence. Flavor essence, of course, is a very diplomatic term. It sounds like something that wafts gently from a pie window or is handcrafted by elves in gauzy aprons. But in the world of Coca-Cola, it was the last surviving whisper of what had once been a fairly bold relationship with stimulants. And the man responsible for this very delicate separation, the caffeine whisperer of his day, was a chap named Dr. Willard Westcott. A pharmacist by training and a bit of an alchemist by hobby, Westcott and his team had set up a laboratory not far from the chemical supplier Maywood Chemical Works. Maywood Chemical was one of those companies where everything looks a little more legal if you squint. They had acquired a license from the US government to import unprocessed coca leaves from Peru. But here's the bedtime twist. They were the only company in the country permitted to do so. And yes, they had precisely one client, Coca-Cola. Like clockwork, shipments of dried coca leaves arrived in barrels every month. They smelled intense. Some described it like a hay bale that went to finishing school in the Andes. These barrels came through US customs under heavy inspection, but with a peculiar caveat. Authorities didn't really care what happened to the flavor. They only cared about the cocaine. Once extracted, the cocaine was legally handed off to a pharmaceutical distributor for medical purposes. The flavor, however, slipped back into the dark corridors of cola. This is where Westcott's technique came in. A chemical ballet that filtered the psychoactive out, but kept the zing. It involved special solvents, temperature-controlled rotary evaporators, and presumably a brave lab assistant whose nostrils occasionally went numb. The process, referred to in Coca-Cola's inner circle as decocainization, was less of a removal and more of a gentle persuasion. The coca leaves were steeped, drained, filtered, steamed, and, at long last, had their headiest habit-forming traits sent packing. What remained was a slightly earthy essence, one that curled into a tiny jar labeled Merchandise Number 5. Now, this tiny jar was not openly acknowledged by the recipe. In fact, Coca-Cola kept Merchandise Number 5 under such tight secrecy that only 2 people in the entire company knew how it was used in the final blend. It was the soft-spoken crescendo in the company's fabled 7X flavor formula, hidden like the 7th gnome in a fairy tale forest of citrus oils and cinnamon. The brilliance of the entire operation was not just its chemical finesse, but its plausible deniability. Coca-Cola could now say, with a blinding sort of honesty, that there was no cocaine in their product, which was true. Technically, mostly. But of course, the leaves still made the journey, still quietly nestled into shipments marked with vague language and polite deception, still passed from the clean laboratory hands of Westcott and Company into the secretive, syrupy heart of America's favorite drink. And as our scene settles into the hush of dimmed lamplight and chalky ledger books, one must wonder just who else might have known about the peculiar path these leaves took. Well, as it turns out, not all secrets traveled by post. Sometimes they were carried by train. As the calendar turned into the 1920s, the air across the American South practically glittered with change. Jazz was slipping through the windows like cool moonlight, Automobiles coughed and sputtered along dusty roads, and an unassuming greenish shrub, Erythroxylum coca, if you're trying to impress someone at a dinner party, was slowly being nudged out of America's favorite drink by something far more bureaucratic than botanical, federal regulation. But despite Washington's best efforts to keep noses clean and beverages boring, Coca-Cola wasn't about to let go of its coca leaf secret entirely. No, it simply became more discreet about it. Enter the curious world of Stepan Chemical Company, a name that sounds more like a Cold War villain than the unlikely hero of a caffeinated bedtime saga. Based in Maywood, New Jersey, this seemingly sleepy suburb became the only place in the United States legally allowed to import coca leaves. Not for wild parties, no. Stepan was approved by the DEA to decocanize coca, a word that sounds like it belongs in a sci-fi opera, but really just means we remove the fun part and hand the leaves off to Coca-Cola, while the extracted cocaine goes on to very legitimate pharmaceutical purposes, like numbing dentistry tools and the occasional confident squirrel undergoing outpatient surgery. Okay, not really with the squirrels. Thanks to an extremely niche exception in American drug policy, the story of coca leaves didn't end marched out of office by a morality brigade. It just slipped underground into warehouses and laboratories, where lab-coated specialists quietly fermented history with thermal jackets and 1930s optimism. But back in Atlanta, the rattle of syrup tanks and the slap of bottle caps kept the Coke machine going. The company now had a fresh logistical puzzle: how to quietly receive its secret ingredient without inviting the sort of attention that turns board meetings into courtroom dramas. The answer, as it turns out, was delightfully ordinary. Every so often, a large, unassuming truck would trundle across the country, looking for all the world like it carried a shipment of typewriter parts, or maybe just an unreasonable number of shoes. But nestled inside, behind wooden crates marked with entirely unconvincing labels, sat the decoconized coca extract, the by now defanged leafy shadow of its South American cousin. The workers who handled this shipment had long since stopped thinking about it as strange. After all, it was just another part of the process, like munging sugar or greasing the bottling machines. But they knew in a quiet way that what they were transporting was special. Not because it sparked euphoria or numbed gums, but because it was the soul of the brand. The flavor that whispered, subtly, from the back of your tongue. Not quite vanilla, not quite herbal. A mystery note that should have had its own jazz solo. To comply with the law and avoid awkward questions, Coca-Cola started doubling down on its trade secret approach. No one person knew the full recipe. It was like a flavor version of a pirate's treasure map, split, hidden, and protected by commercial paranoia wrapped in Southern charm. At Coca-Cola's headquarters, vaults were installed, and only a select few, so few they could audition together for a barbershop quartet, had access to the complete formula. These chosen few were allegedly barred from flying together, lest a tragic accident take down the entire beverage brain trust in one go. Whether that's true or just corporate folklore passed around like Thanksgiving cranberry sauce remains uncertain. But if you ever notice a Coca-Cola executive refusing to board the same elevator as their colleague, now you might know why. Meanwhile, the other ingredient in this sleepy stew of secrecy was time. Coca-Cola had now passed into a new era, one where image reigned supreme. Even as the Coca product quietly made its way into the gigantic syrup vats, the company's branding danced with polar bears and twinkled with holiday lights. The leaf that once launched 1,000 pharmacy counters was never acknowledged in ads. Not even a wink. But in Maywood, behind the brick walls and curious smiles of Stepan Company chemists, the legacy still flowed. They went about their days wearing goggles and gloves, distilling dreams down to legal compliance and scentless goo. Some of them knew the story. Others didn't want to ask. And as another hush-hush shipment made its way south, through highways and sleepy towns and billboard-studded backroads, a quiet little tradition kept bottling its history in every sip. Next, we turn to the people who guarded the syrup's secret recipe, Not with swords or spells, but with policies, and perhaps the occasional fib told over coffee and a wink. By 1901, Atlanta had become a city of ticking clocks and impatient railcars, the city's heart. He pulsed to the rhythm of typewriter clatter and steamboat whistles. No one had time for languid tea parties, not unless they involved syrupy soda in wobbly glasses, fizzing with the oxymoronic promise of energy and calm. And that was Coca-Cola's grand trick. It shimmered in store windows, promised rejuvenation with a smirk, and behind it all, there still lingered a certain hush-hush briskness about a special ingredient. The kind of ingredient that arrived not in wooden barrels, but under the table, quite literally. Now the company line, carefully drafted in gentlemanly cursive, insisted there was only one kind of coca leaf used in the syrup-making process, legal, decoconized, and imported under strict supervision. Certainly, no mischief here, carry on, but the actual ballet beneath the surface required far more choreography. Enter Maywood Pharmaceutical Works, a modest laboratory in New Jersey that rather inconspicuously became the kingdom of Coca-Colas. Sir Coca. The firm had received a unique federal license to import coca leaves. Yes, the very leaves from the Andes Mountains, where altitude sickness meets spirited agriculture. Under this license, vast shipments of Peruvian coca leaves made their way to the US. Not directly to Atlanta, of course. Not when one has the forethought to maintain a squeaky clean southern image. Instead, the leaves came by steamship to New York Harbor, then traveled via rail in sealed containers, labeled with something innocuous like botanical materials for processing, because legal narcotic foliage didn't test well on shipping labels. Once at Maywood, the leaves were dissected with surgical elegance. They were steeped, soaked, cajoled of their alkaloids, the very soul of their stimulating properties, by processes only lab-coated men and government inspectors knew and never spoke of. The extracted cocaine itself, technically the controlled substance of interest, was handed over to the US government for medical purposes. You may imagine bony 1900s doctors placing a dollop into glass vials with steady insistence, strictly for dental surgery and unfortunate wartime injuries. Meanwhile, the decocainized coca leaves, the leftovers, the shells, the ghosts of Andean stamina, were packed up, kissed goodnight by federal examiners, and redirected southward to Atlanta. And here, our story narrows to a sequence almost ritualistic. Rail cars would pull up near the Coca-Cola plant under cover of twilight, or technically, under layers of unrelated cargo, like sugar barrels and wooden crates full of bottle caps. Few knew the true value of the crates marked MW Botanical Residue Number 17, save for a few meticulously loyal warehousemen, a couple of dry-mouthed train conductors, and, rumor had it, a stray cat at the depot that always sniffed those crates with more than casual interest. A handful of trusted workers formed what can only be described as a vigilante. T-Club with security clearance. Their task: receive the crates, carefully unload them without attracting attention from the overly curious, and deliver them to the refinery room behind the bottling floor. No uniforms, no official records, just muscle memory, nods, and an understanding that November shipments were more fragrant. What makes this doubly delightful is this: these workers weren't pawns in some vast corporate conspiracy. No. They were secret enthusiasts, connoisseurs of the covert coca loop. They called themselves, playfully, the Leaf Wranglers. It was never written down, but there was something reassuring about the way they might wink, tilt their caps, and refer to their afternoon break as time to wrangle the green. Of course, the brass upstairs never acknowledged such a club existed. Officially, Coca-Cola was pristine. It had obedient chemists and formulators, and the occasional lawyer with a strong interest in plant-based imports. But the quiet machinery of the company also depended upon men who knew precisely how many crates could be slipped off a freight car without someone from the municipal food board noticing. As nocturnal deliveries continued, Atlanta's streets remained none the wiser. Children pressed their noses to candy store windows for a glimpse of the famous red and white logo. Ladies sipped from soda fountains with genteel gossip gently bubbling above their glasses. And the leaf wranglers finished their shift, dusted the leaf particles from their sleeves, and strolled into the humid Georgia dusk with the satisfaction of a job deliciously done. Of course, those crates from Maywood didn't just find their way to Atlanta all on their own. There's a journey there, stamped with customs declarations, sealed by bribes, and occasionally misplaced in rail yard mysteries. How, you wonder, did something so tangled remain so hush-hush for so long? Well, the next part of the story rides the rails. By the spring of 1903, the city of Atlanta shimmered with its usual red brick charm, punctuated by slow streetcars and the ever-present clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone. It was a time of fine waistcoats, gentle gossip, and enough cigar smoke to blot out the sun if folks lingered too long in any one gentleman's club. But something else, much quieter, was stirring behind the brick facades and creaky warehouse doors. A shift inside the Coca-Cola company itself. You see, while most of the world sipped their way through tumblers of this fizzy miracle drink, very few knew what gave it its signature twitch. Yes, it had a little caffeine, and yes, it had a smidge of sugar. But then there was that other thing, a whisper of it, a ghost of zing, the stuff of nervy energy and tightly clenched handshakes. That special ingredient, as you may recall, came from the leaves of the coca plant. Now, before your imagination begins conducting a high-octane train into scandal territory, it's worth saying that in 1903, there was no great fuss about coca as an ingredient in medicine or in soda. In fact, it was as common in tonics as chicken was in Sunday dinners. But this was also the year when the walls began to wobble. The progressive era, all parades and clipboards, was rising with a steam whistle of reformist energy. Public awareness around things like food safety and the contents of so-called miracle cures was gaining momentum. Muckraking journalists sniffed their way into all sorts of factories, and let's just say, people were finding more than butter in their biscuits. Enter Coca-Cola's own internal reckoning. It happened not with a bang, but with a meeting, held behind thick oak doors in a quiet office where the lemonade was suspiciously fizzy and the minutes were taken in pencil, lest edits be required. The executives gathered, dapper mustaches and all, and pondered, was it worth keeping the Coca in Coca-Cola? More importantly, could they safely keep the name Coca-Cola while pivoting away from its most vibrant botanical? Now, what's particularly amusing about this moment in history is how extraordinarily complicated it got, simply to not say what everyone was silently panicking about. They spoke in code, referring to Formula Substance Number 7, and one junior executive even suggested they just replace it with cinnamon. No one took him seriously again. But the dilemma was quite real. On one hand, the risk of public backlash was beginning to loom. On the other, removing the coca outright might make the drink taste flat, and worse, unprofitable. The secret, they decided, was to keep the leaf, but remove its pep. And thus began a most remarkable, softly absurd mission to decocanize the coca leaf. A phrase so gentle it sounds like a spa treatment, but in fact required a brilliant dance between chemists, diplomats, and some very determined warehouse clerks who really just wanted a normal Tuesday, the company that rose. To the task was a modest little outfit from New Jersey called the Maywood Chemical Company. Their job, to delicately extract the coca essence, the aroma and flavor, without triggering the, well, more excitable qualities of its native alkaloids. It was tricky work. In modern terms, imagine trying to separate the party from the party hat. But with some German-engineered machinery and what appears to have been an Olympic level of paperwork, Maywood managed it. They would receive shipments of coca leaf, legally imported under tight restrictions, remove the stimulant content, and then send the sanitized flavor essence along to Coca-Cola's syrup plant, where it was churned into that signature caramel jazz. Now, you may ask, How did all those coca leaves get imported without raising eyebrows, flags, or the neighbor's cat? Ah, dear listener, that requires the help of a little legal magic, Operation Stepan. But let's not tumble too far down that rabbit hole just yet. Tonight, just let your thoughts drift to the image of bespectacled chemists in lab coats, holding up flasks like they were deciphering moonlight, of crates stamped with customs approvals, quietly humming their way across state lines, and of an entire corporation learning to tiptoe a little more softly, even as it filled America's glasses to the brim. As candles dimmed across Atlanta and the carbonation settled in the bottle, the Coca-Cola company had taken its first formal step away from its once electric past. But the trail of coca would linger just out of sight for decades more. And as it turned out, the leaf itself would have its own long-winded adventures, hidden not in secrecy, but in the fine print. That, of course, is a tale for very patient dreamers, while few people notice the unassuming train car trundling through the Piedmont twilight in the springs of the early 1900s. Those who did were likely distracted by its odd odor, a kind of whispery sharpness that hinted at medicine, mystery, and mischief. Inside, past freight labels that claimed botanical extracts and equipment parts nestled something more polite society preferred not to think about. Dried coca leaves hauled slowly up from a discreet dock in New Jersey. They were headed inland, very inland. Now, coca leaves were not rare in the world of pharmaceuticals at the time. Apothecaries used them with an enthusiasm that today might earn them a stern letter from the DEA. But for Coca-Cola, a bubbly potion long past its medicinal masquerade, these leafy, controversial guests were a tightly held secret. See, ever since cocaine was frowned upon, somewhere between the mustachioed era of vigorous cycling and the moral crusades of early Rotarians, Coca-Cola had to dance a delicate waltz. They wanted the flavor of the coca leaf, but not the inhale through nose side effects. Enter a chemist named Charles Neeson, no relation to the actor, sadly. Neeson was a proper Aussie, bespectacled alchemist of the corporate variety who worked inside the sleepy facilities of Maywood Chemical Works in New Jersey. Hidden behind iron gates and even denser ledgers, Maywood held what was perhaps America's most curious arrangement, a federal license to process the famously naughty leaf into something far more respectable. The job was to extract the cocaine from the leaves. Completely. Regina, the secretary, was very clear. Completely. The cocaine, the part that kept Victorian poets awake for 3 straight days, was removed and handed over to pharmaceutical companies like Mallinckrodt, who tried not to ask too many questions about why their stock boys were always humming. What remained after this detoxification was something called merchandise number 5, a delightful euphemism that practically winked at you as it passed in a brown bottle. This syrupy concentrate was then boxed, stamped, and shipped to Coca-Cola bottlers, where it joined its sassy companion, a cola nut, in a sugary tango that never disclosed its true origins. But while this sounds all very coordinated and permitted, the sleepy secret lay not in the process, but in the people. The workers at Maywood weren't just chemists. They were guardians of a recipe they couldn't officially acknowledge. In the labs, employees whispered nicknames like the Leaf Lady and Dr. DeCoke, while rumors swirled that one technician could smell residual cocaine in a batch from halfway down the hall and with the flu. These were fine workers, serious folks who labored alongside caution signs and the occasional forgotten government inspector. But they also were people who quietly reveled in the knowledge they were part of a confectionery caper, transforming an international narcotic into a beloved supermarket staple. It became an unofficial game of pride. Who could purify the leaves with the highest yield and the lowest trace? Who could do it without setting off the cocaine? Trace detector, a device which, yes, did exist, and yes, looked a little bit like a toaster with a grudge. By the 1920s, while public taste had shifted firmly to less meth in our drinks, please, Coca-Cola had done the improbable. It had navigated the moral purges, the war on drugs' early mutterings, and still managed to extract the exotic echo of the coca leaf without legal drama or newspaper scandal. Occasionally, of course, a rumor would surface, and every so often, a journalist with a particular gift for inconvenient curiosity would put on a trench coat and try to find out why Coke still needed coca shipments long after cocaine became taboo. But those stories never quite stuck. Likely because the company and its quiet network of leaf whisperers and syrup dreamers had perfected their own sleepy system. 1 part chemical precision, 2 parts bureaucratic camouflage, and a final dash of southern charm. And so each time a Coca-Cola bottle was opened, somewhere in Atlanta or Albany or Albuquerque, a small secret lineage could be traced, back to a railway car painted the color of faded authority, to the humming machines of New Jersey, and to the secret hearts of the workers who turned scandalous shrubs into fizzy Americana. But before we drift any further down the fizz-soaked corridors of this tale, we must turn our attention to the man who made it all possible. Through charm, cunning, and a curiously legal loophole the size of a mild riverboat. By 1904, the Coca-Cola company was facing the snoozy sort of dilemma that tends to keep marketing men up at night, and chemists up even later. The world was changing, and so was the recipe. Coca-Cola had begun its dazzling ascent, not just as a soda, but as an elixir, a nerve tonic, and strangely, a moral quandary. You see, the drink's early secret, it really did contain cocaine, a less than minor detail that was becoming harder to brush under the Persian rug. The public was catching on. Progressives were frowning hard. And governments? Oh, they were stirring from their long nap and beginning to regulate things. Always a menace to the romantics and the pharmacists. So it was time for a change. The cocaine had to go. But not all of it. Enter Stepan Company, a modest chemical firm in Maywood, New Jersey, which was quietly poised to become the most oddly essential character in this entire fizzy tale. Their task: extract the naughty alkaloid from the erythroxylum coca leaf, rendering the plant spent and therefore safe, but still aromatic enough to satisfy the mysterious flavor requirement in Coca-Cola's merchandise number 5. To be clear, it was the leaf oils, complex, citrusy, and faintly verdant, that the company craved now. Not the part that made pianos fly. But how exactly does one import a mountain of coca leaves, still very much illegal in just about every context, except, apparently, when you whisper, "It's for soda," and have a good lawyer? The trick was this: everything had to look astronomically boring. While throngs of the news-hungry nation were marveling over sensational crimes and turn-of-the-century baseball, great bales of dried Peruvian coca leaves were being shipped with a quiet, bureaucratic dignity to New Jersey, under the watchful eye of federal permits, 3 dull forms in triplicate, and a mutual agreement to not talk about it at dinner parties. Now, you may be wondering, how did a sleepy New Jersey factory come to hold one of the only legal rights in America to import coca leaves? The answer, dear listener, lies in a stunning mixture of timing, chemistry, and the peculiar American capacity to turn contraband into paperwork. The Stepan Company secured a unique agreement: 1 part US Drug Enforcement Administration certification, 1 part don't ask too many questions, historical inertia, and began quietly processing coca for Coca-Cola under a government-sanctioned narcotics quota that made accountants feel faint just thinking about it. The lab workers at Stepan, well, they were a curious little cadre, not exactly alchemists, more like botanical bureaucrats with goggles. Their job was to receive bales of leaves from overseas, mostly from Peru and Bolivia, then carefully extract the cocaine, which would be handed over to the government for medical use, and send the leftover, legally harmless leaf extract to Coca-Cola's secret flavor vault, somewhere in the shadows of Atlanta. The actual process, while highly controlled, was oddly elegant in its simplicity. Steep the leaves, distill their essence, and separate the good stuff from the scandalous bits. It was like making tea, except if the tea bag could land you 30 years in federal prison if you misplaced it. And yet, this arrangement worked smoothly, efficiently, and so quietly that nearly no one knew about the sleepy New Jersey cocaine factory just off the boulevard, hidden behind a line of respectable-looking hedges and a very stern receptionist. Even those who did know often didn't grasp the surrealism of it all. A bona fide DEA-licensed cocaine lab operating ever so peacefully to make your soda taste just right, while America debated the merits of jazz, prohibition, and whether neckties should be skinny or wider this year. There's something strangely comforting about this odd dance. Coca-Cola, the federal government, and a tiny band of chemical stewards working together in bureaucratic harmony to ensure your icy refreshment included just the right whisper of forbidden flora, with none of the inconvenient felonies. And tonight, as the leaves rustle gently in an industrial drum somewhere in northern New Jersey, steeping their way into carbonation history, one can't help but feel a certain sleepy awe at how complicated simplicity can be. Now, while the workers clocked out and locked the lab behind them, a much trickier question was beginning to brew. Not in the beakers, but in the courtroom. Across the state line, legal minds were preparing to challenge Coke's secret head-on, one headline at a time, in the cobwebbed corners of the 1920s, beneath the pressed hats and jazz trumpet bravado of the age. Something curiously hush-hush was happening along a transatlantic pipeline, so secret it didn't even have a name. It was simply the Way. This way, in reality, took the form of wooden crates marked innocuously as dental supplies, textile colorants, or, delightfully, Peruvian tea. Of course, once opened, none would find dentures, dyes, or leaves suitable in polite society's china cups. Instead, these were caged shipments of coca extract, decocainized, officially, but not until much later, much more publicly, and only after some creative paperwork. The workers behind these shipments, mostly stevedores at ports like Hamburg, Marseille, and Norfolk, became accidental connoisseurs of international subterfuge. Most didn't know exactly what the extract was, though some suspected it had to be good, because tiny mustachioed men in suits far too warm for summer handled every crate like it contained gold, or possibly the Holy Grail marinated in molasses. One of these stevedores, a fellow by the name of Horace Hambone Ellery, was particularly good with crates. Not opening them, heavens no, but stacking them with the reverence of a monk preparing communion. Hambone once claimed he could smell the difference between a box of vanilla concentrate and a shipment of coca leaves just by walking past. It's got a crispness, he'd tell the other workers at Pier 9, like pine needles that went to finishing school. Nobody knew what that meant exactly, but they nodded solemnly, because Hambone said it with such authority, and also because it was better than discussing how little they were being paid. Meanwhile, the folks above Hambone's pay grade, the gentlemen at Stepan Chemical Company in New Jersey, were managing the delicate dance of legality and chemistry. By the late 1920s, the Harrison Narcotics Act had swirled into effect, declaring cocaine a bad thing. Emphasis on the capital B and T. However, it came with a rather useful loophole the size of a legal shrug. Coca leaves could still be imported if their medicinal elements were removed by authorized hands. Stepan and Company volunteered those very hands. And so the company received government approval to run the only cocaine removal operation in the United States, which, in polite terms, meant they were allowed to import bales of coca leaves, strip away the naughty parts under strict regulations, and then pass the squeaky clean leftover flavor to another southern party, a certain sugary syrup company in Atlanta. From a distance, this looked rather bureaucratic. Up close, it looked like a mild cloak and dagger ballet with an aftertaste of cola nut. Of course, the people working those flavor vats, everyday technicians with names like Mabel, Floyd, and the ever-punctual Clarence, weren't always aware of the journey their ingredients had made. But they did marvel at how Batch 44, as the Coca-Cola concentrate stream was known, smelled like citrus florals had been taught how to tango. Clarence, in particular, was in charge of the final mixture. He treated the vat not just as a culinary experiment, but as a living creature that had to be wooed with temperature, stirred with grace, and allowed to rest like a Victorian heroine before bottling. Once, when asked about the flavor profile, Clarence responded with, "Imagine if a lemon and a vanilla bean went on holiday with a very energetic friend from Peru." He never elaborated who that friend was, but it didn't take a codebreaker to read between the lines. Back on the docks, crates continued to come and go. Hambone eventually took up whittling in his off hours, crafting little wooden miniatures of the mystery crates he'd hauled for decades. One was labeled simply Essence of Curiosity. It now sits, forgotten by most, in a dusty glass case at a portside museum next to an anchor and a sandwich token from the 1933 World's Fair. And even as the coca leaves made their quiet way inland, changing hands, passport stamps, and chemical composition, the public continued sipping Coca-Cola in wide-necked glass bottles, blissfully unaware that their favorite fizzy pick-me-up had been on a journey more dramatic than most epic novels. Next, we'll drift into the peculiar realm of how one American chemist, armed with a mustache and a magnifying glass, nearly spilled the secret recipe on accident over a cup of tea and an argument about nutmeg. By the time the 1930s came curling around the corner, like a polite yet insistent breeze asking America if it had considered calisthenics and better hats, Coca-Cola had well and truly bubbled to the surface of popular culture, one syrupy bottle at a time. But if you quietly tiptoed behind the fizzy curtain of fame, past the wholesome advertisements, and into the shaded depths of the company's production chain, you would find an odd little web of logistics holding the heart of the recipe together. You see, the true sparkle in Coca-Cola's concoction came from a particular ingredient famously known, at least behind closed boardroom doors, as merchandise number 5. The identity of merchandise numbers 1 through 4 remains a matter of corporate legend and perhaps the stuff of a sleepy archivist's dreams. But merchandise number 5, that was the one everyone whispered about, because beneath layers of heated caramel and cola nut, it involved a little-known South American shrub with a rather unassuming personality. On the surface, the coca plant, in its natural state, grows at high altitudes and high drama. Nestled among the Andes, it's been used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years, not to starve, in soft drinks, but as a mild stimulant to keep you climbing up hills and possibly herding llamas with a bit more pep. Here's where things begin to swirl in slow circles of charming complexity. In the modest township of Maywood, New Jersey, a quiet little operation called Stepan Company had, through a curious blend of luck, paper trails, and bureaucratic acrobatics, become the only commercial importer of coca leaves in the entire United States. Now, that's a dinner party fact that tends to wake the eyebrows. Stepan didn't operate like some underground cartel. Far from it. They had licenses in order, paperwork tidy as a librarian's desk, and they shipped their leaves in dull, hopelessly respectable crates. The US government, as it happens, also had a hand in this dance. The Drug Enforcement Administration, whose name alone could cure most parties of fun, watched over these imports with the delicacy of a hall monitor who's just discovered sarcasm. The imported coca leaves first met their fate in the heat and hush of the processing rooms. There, inside a facility more beige than scandalous, the active substance in the leaves, yes, that one, was extracted under government supervision so tight it could have earned its own steel briefcase. This portion, naturally, was destroyed or handed off to pharmaceutical use under glassy-eyed compliance. But what remained, those spent leaves, like a tea bag that's seen better mornings, still held a whisper of that Andes essence, a bit of oil, a ghost of flavor, and that spectral shadow of coca is what found its way into Coca-Cola. Not illegal, not particularly exciting in the chemical sense anymore, but just enough to say that coca still lived quietly in the heart of the cola, like an old actor content with a cameo in a film they once starred in. This entire operation flew comfortably under most radars, save for the occasional journalist with insomnia and a magnifying glass. But for most, Americans, sipping their sodas on porches and diner stools, this path, from coca field to cola fizzle, remained as invisible as the carbonation escaping unnoticed, while you ponder life's big questions, like whether straws make you look dignified or just confused. The workers at Stepan Company went about this surreal routine with the calm solemnity reserved for Swiss watchmakers and overly subtle magicians. Their livelihoods depended on discretion, compliance, and a good lunch break. Rumor has it that their break room vending machine didn't even carry Coke, which feels like either irony or an OSHA violation. And yet, isn't that the essence of old history? Not in the garish headlines or the statues squinting sternly at pigeons, but in the quiet routines of underpaid workers boiling down leaves and stamping government forms in triplicate, all to fuel a beverage's fizzy mythology. As night stretches over our story like a blanket that forgets the corners, we leave New Jersey's sleepy import facility just as the shift changes. A fresh crew rolls in, the lights hum to life, and somewhere a crate creaks open. Far away, a Coca-Cola bottle tips sideways with a hiss, somewhere in Georgia or maybe in Germany. And yet, behind every sip, behind every advertisement with polar bears and improbable Santa Clauses, there is always a paper trail, a hidden ingredient, and a worker who knew exactly where the coca leaf went, once upon a time. Let's follow that scent a bit further, shall we? In the gentle haze of the 1920s, amid the clinking of Art Deco cocktail glasses and the slow rise of jazz's golden hour, something rather curious was taking place beneath the polished surface of the Coca-Cola Company. A clandestine ballet of boxes, codes, and cordial nods, performed by men in starched suits and stiff shoes. This was a world where briefcases held more than just memos, and one very specific Peruvian shrub leaf had to be handled with the discretion of a state. Secret. And that's where we find ourselves now, trailing a cast of middle managers who, despite their modest titles, were orchestrating international logistics like choreographers of the forbidden. You see, by this time, Coca-Cola had deeply woven itself into the fabric of American identity. It was what you reached for at lunch counters, what you craved beside the radio, and what your neighbor's uncle claimed could cut through engine grease. Still, that secret ingredient, the one some folks suspected of being merely nutmeg and good lighting, that was no ordinary flavoring. It called for a very specific process, and more importantly, a very specific type of person to move it discreetly from the Andes to Atlanta without spooking the feds or the general population. Enter the third-floor gentlemen, named not because their office was on the third floor, though it was, but because only 3 of them were allowed to know how the operation truly worked. They never traveled together, never dined out at the same place, and always referred to the leaf shipments as Botanical Research Material A. They even assigned it a friendly nickname, Brenda. So while America whirled through Prohibition, with its bootleggers and speakeasies and suspiciously enthusiastic grape juice advertisements, Coca-Cola's quietly legal, yet eyebrow-raising ingredient snuck through customs with all the confidence of a choir boy walking into a jazz club. Now, most of this mystery swirled behind the walls of a single building, tucked away in Maywood, New Jersey. It didn't look like much, a modest factory that threw off the scent by processing other, far less scandalous substances like fragrances, flavorings, and the occasional unlucky ton of clove extract. But deep in one shadowed room, behind a door plainly yet ominously marked, "Authorized personnel only," Brenda got her makeover. Here, in this sleepy suburb of chemical subtlety, Stepan Company, the only firm in the United States to be licensed by the federal government to import coca leaves, did the delicate dance of decocanization. Don't worry, you're not saying it wrong. That's the actual word. The leaves came in, the juice, as they say, came out. Cocaine, the star player that got all the press, was meticulously removed and handed off to a completely different pharmaceutical partner, Mallinckrodt, a company that handled opium, morphine, and other substances guaranteed to raise the collective blood pressure of a colonial-era town council. the extracted cocaine was sold for anesthetic use under strictly regulated conditions, because nothing says orthodontic surgery like an ingredient smuggled in under the cover of flavored soda innovation. What remained after this milder form of alchemy was known as merchandise number 5 inches, an extract so blandly named it could have easily shared a shelf with potato flake, industrial, or paint color. Off-white number 4. Yet this humble concoction would travel onward, slipped into syrup mixtures in guarded Coca-Cola factories, and finally into the iconic bottle, where it transformed into effervescent delight, mystery intact. Back in Maywood, the workers who handled these leaves spoke in half-jokes and knowing glances. They weren't exactly international smugglers, but they knew they had clearance levels somewhat above your average pepper slicer. They took lunch breaks, just like everyone else, but no one ever asked what was in the room behind the grey door. Or if they did, they learned quickly that silence paired exquisitely with sandwiches. One worker would later describe the daily arrival of the botanical material as being as regular as the mailman, only, he added, with fewer questions and better perfume. The leaves arrived packed tight in burlap sacks, reeking of high mountain air and the faint, spicy scent of something your grandmother might call medicinal. In truth, these workers were guardians of illusion, ensuring that every bottle of Coke carried its century-old essence, minus the parts that might make you dance on the ceiling. Their job was neither loud nor recognized, but in the realm of fizz and folklore, they were the secret spice handlers, the keepers of just a hint of something thrilling. And while most of America was busy sipping, burping, and wondering what exactly made this drink so magical, the Maywood crew would quietly return to their duties, watching powdered gloves disappear into morning sunbeams and telling no one, not even their wives, what Brenda had been up to today. Next, perhaps, we take a closer look at how Coca-Cola managed to convince the world that this entire arrangement was simply good marketing. At the tippy-toed edge of the 20th century, in the fragrant corners of New Jersey's bustling docks, a quiet ballet played out in cargo holds and customs terminals, one choreographed with the delicacy of diplomacy, the flair of mischief, and just a whisper of plausible deniability. The stage was Port Elizabeth. The dancers, a select group of men employed by Stepan Company, a well-tailored chemical firm with curious cargo and a contract so discreet it may as well have been written in lemon juice and read only under candlelight. Their starring role, handling one of the most mysterious substances in modern geriatric confection, the decoconized coca leaf. Now, let's pause here. It's important we say that again, very gently. Decoconized. That means the cocaine part, the, shall we say, speedier bits, was lovingly coaxed out in a sciencey sort of spa treatment involving solvents, centrifuges, and possibly soft jazz. What was left behind was the innocent cousin, just flavorful, herbaceous coca material, ready to star in the secretive syrup known only as Merchandise 7X. But before that could happen, the cargo, bales of Peruvian coca leaves wrapped in brown paper, like Christmas in an old apothecary, had to pass through customs. Legally. Sort of. The workers knew the drill, and the drill had evolved into an art form. When the sealed containers arrived from Peru, often listed under flavoring agents or botanical imports, the dockside crew would roll them into a shadowy back room that smelled faintly of peat moss and bureaucratic guilt. In that room, beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed like judgmental wasps, sat a federal narcotics inspection officer from the DEA. He had a clipboard, a lukewarm cup of coffee, and, crucially, a healthy appreciation for how this thing needed to stay quiet. He would inspect a sampling of the leaves, never all, just enough to satisfy office procedures. Occasionally he'd swipe a finger across a burlap sack, nod sagely and murmur, "Yep, leafy." Then the crates passed into Stepan's sleepy compound in Maywood, New Jersey. Now, this is no Willy Wonka fantasy. The Stepan plant, from the outside, resembled a cardboard box masquerading as a building. But inside it hosted a rather elegant chemical ballet. There were enormous stainless steel drums, vats that glugged suspiciously, and men in white coats who seemed incapable of gossip. Which was fortunate, considering they were handling a substance one could describe, very delicately, as extremely illegal if left untreated. Here's where the magic happened. The raw coca leaves were doused in a solution, heated, swirled, and passed through a mysterious machine that we're fairly sure doesn't exist on record. This enigmatic contraption performed the delicate uncocaining process, leaving behind only the flavorful essence of coca. The workers tended to speak about it in hushed terms. "We're removing the spicier seasoning," one of them joked once as he opened a valve. "Keeps the soda from getting too energetic." The cocaine itself, yes, the actual ejected alkaloid, wasn't discarded. That would have been gauche. Legally, and rather ironically, the purified cocaine was passed along under strict regulatory handling to a pharmaceutical company called Mallinckrodt, the kind of place with important-looking doors and Latin on the letterhead. There it joined the ranks of painkillers, dental anesthetics, and adventurous nose surgeries. Meanwhile, the rest of the coca, a harmless, bitter botanical extract, was bottled up neatly and sent in sealed barrels to Atlanta, home base of Coca-Cola. These were the ingredients' final footsteps before becoming part of the mythical merchandise 7X, the tightly guarded formula that involved orange oil, vanilla, caramel, acai, and yes, our now entirely innocent coca. Keep in mind, none of this could be advertised. You couldn't exactly slap "contains a whisper of Peruvian mountain leaves" on the bottle. In fact, Coca-Cola's public materials merely stated natural flavors. Not wrong, but certainly minimalist in information. So the workers moved in silence, like church mice with chemistry degrees. They knew they were part of something historic and deeply weird. They also knew, from the small cash bonuses and the rather firm non-disclosure agreements, that this job wasn't exactly listed on the company picnic flyer. Their hands, steady as metronomes, kept the process going year after year, decade after decade. No plaque ever went up. No headlines were written. And yet, thanks to their gentle mischief, millions of people around the world could take a sip of something fizzy and sweet and vaguely herbal, never knowing just how much customs paperwork had been involved. And so, the flow of the leaf, through secret contracts, sleepy ports, and into carbonated legend, continued with the precision of a Swiss watch stuck in a candy store. But, as you may have guessed by now, the plant in Maywood was only one piece of the puzzle. There were other eyes keeping watch, and sometimes those eyes blinked. The coca leaf, delicate and misunderstood, had journeyed far from its highland home, passed from Quechua hands to industrial mysteries, from sacred ritual to sparkling refreshment. But its path to Coca-Cola's famously vague merchandise number 5 wasn't just paved in secrecy and science. It was smuggled through bureaucracy with the cunning precision of accountants too polite to admit what they were really doing. Here, dear listener, is where our story becomes curiously bureaucratic in the softest, most shuffle of paper kind of way. Because once coca leaves were allowed entry into the United States, strictly for decocainization, of course, a brilliant little dance began between federal forms, pharmaceutical firms, and one mild-tempered chemical processing plant hiding modestly in New Jersey. Picture a place called Maywood Chemical Works, not the kind of outfit that would ever be described as glamorous. No dazzling signage, no bubbling beakers with neon liquids, just squat, beige, buildings, labeling machines, and folks in lab coats who quietly went about the deeply intriguing but gravely dull business of removing the naughty bits from South America's most controversial botanical export. Maywood had struck gold. Not literal gold, but a contract with Coca-Cola to take in raw coca leaves, gently whisper away their cocaine content, legally, and then pass along the rest, the warm, woodsy essence of the leaf that, at least according to Coca-Cola's own carefully phrased statements, contributed absolutely no stimulant effects whatsoever. Only flavor, smile. Now, There's caffeine in Coca-Cola, that's no secret. But the coca extract, that, my drowsy friend, was hidden in plain bureaucratic view as something called spent coca leaf, a perfectly dry business-like term, like retired lettuce, almost poetic in how unpoetic it is. Under the watchful eye of the Drug Enforcement Administration, who maintained all the stern enthusiasm of a chaperone at a high school dance, the process was tightly controlled. The coca leaves were imported only by special permit, stored like royalty in DEA-certified vaults, and processed only by employees who had passed more security checks than some small-town mayors. And yet, every so often, behind these sleepy protocols, the unexpected would bloom. A worker might spot a scribbled note tucked into a bale of dried coca, a salutation, a joke, a drawing of a chicken on a skateboard, perhaps sent from a Peruvian laborer, or maybe just the imagination of a man too long surrounded by cardboard and alkaloid vapors. These little oddities would drift through the plant like perfume, then vanish into the grey mist of compliance paperwork and union coffee breaks. Perhaps the most amusing thing, though, is that the plant didn't entirely hide what it was doing. Technically, everyone in the relevant departments knew. But the phrasing, ah yes, that was the magic. Official documents referred breezily to preparation of flavoring agents or extracts for beverage use. All technically accurate, all thoroughly sleep-inducing. In marketing materials, the company preferred to talk about botanical integrity, which, depending on your level of caffeine intake, might mean everything or absolutely nothing. Coca-Cola, for its part, remained sphinx-like, its executives occasionally providing statements about the proprietary blend of flavoring ingredients, with all the mystical grandeur of a Victorian apothecary guarding his tonic recipe. At no point did anyone in this long, paper-filled chain ever need to say the actual word cocaine. That, after all, had been thoroughly removed, with science and law and a sigh. And so, each week, flavor barrels were sealed and shipped off to Atlanta to be added to the formula. You know, that formula. The one known by only a handful of people who have surely signed not just confidentiality agreements, but perhaps ancient oaths involving stenographers and small ceremonial locks made entirely of non-disclosure clauses. If you think this all feels somehow too wholesome, this quiet pipeline of ex-naughty leaves transformed into fizzy wholesomeness, well, that's the genius of it. A process so complex and carefully buried that it becomes boring again. And in that boredom lies the perfect cover. In the fluorescent calm of Maywood's processing floor, decades passed. Generations of employees came and went, passing down tales of the barrels, stories of near spills, and once, quite memorably, a Christmas party where someone slipped a Dr. Pepper into the Coke fridge and nearly instigated minor war. But the real secret, the sticky, botanical heart of it, slumbered on beneath it all. And as sugar danced with extract and fizz sparkled into bottles bound for gas stations and grandmothers' fridges, the traces of a once sacred leaf remained, too small to alter minds, but just enough to confuse conspiracy theorists. Curl in now and let that image rest in your mind of beige hallways, hushed workers, and the quiet irony of a global corporation depending entirely on its ability to be very, very boring. And just when you think nothing stranger could possibly happen next, well, you might want to turn your attention to a certain mysterious man with 2 overcoats and an aversion to direct answers. He's coming up as the 1940s rolled onwards like a postal trolley with a squeaky wheel and too many secrets. Coca-Cola found itself increasingly protective over its fabled Merchandise 7X, a syrupy concoction as legendary as it was legally murky. While the exact ingredients file was said to be locked in a vault more secure than a pharaoh's tomb, it was an open secret among certain workers that part of this cherished mixture included something rather botanical. Enter the coca farmers of Peru and Bolivia, experts in cultivating the smooth, glossy leaves of the Erythroxylum coca plant, a shrub so unassuming it might be mistaken for an overachieving basil bush. were it not for its fascinating chemical properties and its starring role in both ancient Incan ceremonies and modern government watch lists. Now, in theory, exporting coca leaves to the United States had been mostly illegal since the mid-1910s. But as with most things in global commerce, there were exceptions with very polite paperwork. And one of those exceptions came adorned with the subtle sparkle of corporate ambition and a wink from the Food and Drug Administration. You see, while the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 had thrown up a bureaucratic barricade on most coca-related importing, a small, very specific loophole remained open just wide enough to allow Stepan Company, a chemical processing firm in New Jersey, to quietly corner the market on legal coca leaf imports. And when we say quietly, we mean about as quiet as a cat creeping past a room full of sleeping Semin dogs. The arrangement was this. Farmers in the Andes would harvest coca leaves with the same ritual precision as their grandfathers had done for centuries, as casually and lovingly as one might pluck mint for tea. From there, massive burlap-wrapped bundles of pungent green cargo were loaded onto trucks, mules, and sometimes tiny rail cars that inexplicably always seemed to have one wheel that didn't quite work. These leaves traveled down highways, scratched into cliffsides, past herds of alpacas with zero respect for motor vehicles, eventually reaching ports where paperwork thicker than the leaves themselves awaited. And then they would board ships to the United States under the sole authorization of the DEA and for one solitary destination, Maywood, New Jersey. Stepan Company's Maywood facility was the only place in the country legally allowed to import coca leaves. Hidden behind bland buildings with perfectly respectable landscaping, Maywood was a true marvel of industrial discretion. No neon signs, no golden arches, just humming machinery, occasional puffs of steam, and a workforce of quietly dedicated chemists who, if asked what they did for a living, would probably shrug and say, "Oh, chemicals." Upon arrival, the leaves would undergo a process not unlike a very sophisticated tea brewing, if your teapot came with a distilled expertise in alkaloid extraction. The point was simple. Remove the cocaine alkaloid, which is the part that, let's say, gets the party started. What was left behind was a flavor extract known as decoconized coca leaf essence, a sort of diet ghost of the original leaf. And this ghostly essence, delicate and subtle, was what flowed into Coca-Cola's factories through utterly legal channels. It was added to the secret 7X formula in whisper quiet spoonfuls, alongside orange oil, cinnamon, coriander, maybe a drop of neroli, and other ingredients that a poet might swoon over and a regulatory agency might scrutinize extremely politely. Of course, all this was done in such secrecy that if you asked most Coke bottlers what gave the drink its sparkle, they'd guess sugar and bubbles. Only a very, very few people knew about the extract's origins. Even fewer knew that the US government routinely facilitated and monitored these imports from South American fields to New Jersey labs, like an odd kind of diplomatic garden club. But the show went on, and the shipments continued. Flanked by ledgers, guard dogs, and a tangle of diplomatic niceties, the coca leaf played its quiet part in the world's most famous fizzy drink. Whether you were sipping it in a 1940s soda fountain or popping a can open half a century later, a little bit of that Andean sunshine made it all the way to your taste buds. Discreetly, of course. And while coca leaves had been reshuffled out of the spotlight, replaced in cultural importance by cola nuts and high fructose corn syrup, their specified role remained. Venerated in hushed corridors and confidential documents. Somewhere between tradition and trade secrets, the legends kept swirling. But there, do you hear that? It's the distant rustle of a leaf, the tap-tap of typewriter keys in an office thick with secrets, as we follow the path not of the leaf itself, but of the men in suits who guarded it, somewhere beneath the wide, slatted sun of the American Southeast, inside a warehouse that looked more like it stored plows and chewing tobacco than international trade secrets, the faint scent of molasses mixed with something far more complicated, the ghost of coca leaves. Not cocaine. That had been worked out of the picture officially, conveniently, and with an almost theatrical wag of the bureaucratic finger. But what remained was far from dull. Let's drift now, quietly, into the 1930s, a time when America was elbow-deep in the Great Depression, and the world had become dustier, quieter, and a little more inventive, especially when it came to moving obscure ingredients under unfriendly radar. In a small Georgia processing facility known only to a handful of executives, a group of trusted workers, let's call them the syrup sorcerers, handled crates marked with names that sounded harmless and sleepy. Peruvian plant extract, botanical goods, tea, which was technically not a lie, depending on your definition of tea and whether you considered plants with a federal restriction a part of your pantry. At the center of this sleepy, mid-century cloak and dagger operation was a special key, a license issued by the US Treasury Department. You see, coca leaves were a Schedule II substance, the sort of thing that made federal agents squint meaningfully over wire-rimmed glasses. But Coca-Cola, being the southern gentleman of soft drink empires, had secured a peculiar little partnership. It was with the Maywood Chemical Works, an unassuming New Jersey plant with all the architectural flair of in oatmeal. Maywood was the only legal recipient of coca leaf imports in the entire country, tasked with the subtle art of removing the naughty bits, namely the cocaine alkaloids, from the leaves. What was left was essentially a whisper of coca, minus the buzz, and it was this whisper that gave Coca-Cola its legally tame but chemically alluring merchandise number 5, one of the cryptic ingredients in the heavily guarded flavor formula. But Maywood didn't make fizzy drinks. It wasn't romantic. And so, after the leaves had been stripped of their party tricks, a quiet shipment would make its way down to Atlanta, where the syrup sorcerers would work their gentle magic. Dilution, infusion, and a kind of floral coaxing known only to flavor chemists. It was here, in rooms that smelled faintly of licorice and eucalyptus, that legal coca flavoring was added to the secret syrup that gave the drink its bite. Only a handful of individuals in the entire Coca-Cola organization knew exactly how this was done, and those who did weren't writing memoirs. Their silence was part of the charm. As for the workers on the line, many of them knew only that crates labeled merchandise came with extra supervision and occasionally sparked curious questions from visiting salesmen, which would be promptly deflected with a soft chuckle and an offer of chilled product. This was also the era when bottling plants were multiplying like rabbits on caffeine. Each plant received base syrup concentrate and mixed it with local water and sugar, bottling the foamy mixture in glass vessels thick enough to survive both transport and prolonged childhood memories. But none of them knew the full recipe, not even close. That wasn't just good business, it was practically high theater. Some who worked in the flavor division spoke in code, referencing elements like they were stage directions in a low-budget chemistry play. "A kiss, more number 7, someone might whisper over a mixing vat. "No, you're back off the vanilla. She's in charge now," another would say, as though the ingredients had egos and footnotes. And perhaps they did. By nightfall, those workers would go home with the scent of cola oil in their hair and secrets pressed gently between their rib cages. They didn't speak much of their work at dinner, not because it was strictly forbidden, but because no one believed it was all that interesting. Just syrup, they'd say. Just syrup. And yet, this gentle choreography between New Jersey chemists and Southern mixers kept a global empire ticking, humming, and bubbling. In the quiet evening just outside that Georgia plant, crickets struck up their string section, and the warm air carried with it the faintest trace of what was and what had been delicately removed before it reached your lips. It was a ghost of a leaf, tucked neatly behind bubbles and storytelling. Soon you'll see how one misplaced invoice and a factory guard with an unusual hobby nearly exposed the whole operation. But that curious turn will wait patiently just beyond this night's last fizz. By the late 1950s, Coca-Cola had completely outgrown its small-town origins and was now a globe-trotting titan. The kind of brand that could put its red and white logo on a lunar lander and people would still shout, "Tastes better with ice." But while the company's fizzy empire was sporting new television ads and vending machines that lit up like alien spacecraft, its most peculiar ingredient, the real fly in the syrupy ointment, still depended on an eccentric tangle of laws, loopholes, and hushed handshakes. And of course, a small but mighty band of workers who made it all hum like clockwork. That special ingredient. The coca leaf. Yes, still. Though now confidently legal, in the way that a dusty law book says something's legal when no one dares to read it too closely, the coca supply chain was a ballet of secrecy and procedural acrobatics, and somewhere backstage were the unsung heroes. Sanitation workers, customs agents with loose lips, and night shift lab technicians who could recite the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act by heart, but only after their second cup of coffee. To understand how this all held together, let's pause for a quick cameo from an utterly unremarkable company with a marvelously dull name, the Maywood Chemical Works. Located in New Jersey, because of course it was, the unpretentious plant looked more like a place that made very persuasive glue than one that helped supply Coca-Cola's most controversial component. And yet, in the maze of its laboratories and storage drums, the coca leaves were quietly decoconized, a term that sounds both wildly complicated and suspiciously made up. But rest assured, it's quite real. That coke-free coca extract still found its way into your bottle of Coke. Now, the workers at Maywood were professionals, chemical engineers who wore lab coats like armor and tracked lab notes with the fastidiousness of monks transcribing scripture. But even so, the job came with more than its fair share of strange perks. One longtime technician once described the warehouse aroma as peppermint meets fresh money, a scent that, depending on your mood, either inspired great chemistry or great confusion. Meanwhile, the coca leaves themselves were arriving in not-so-dramatic shipments, large burlap sacks stamped with bureaucratic cargo codes, handled by men who may or may not have read spy novels over lunch. Thanks to an agreement with the US government, the coca leaf imports were under the watchful eye of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which had a charming habit of auditing coke leaf inventories like they were counting jelly beans at Halloween. Each leaf accounted for, each gram of alkaloid safely extracted and very, very closely monitored. Once the leaves were turned into a decoconized liquid extract, affectionately known behind closed doors as Merchandise 7X's. Cousin. The product was shipped off to Coca-Cola's flavor vault with all the ceremony of a Cold War diplomatic handoff. Few knew exactly how it was blended in. Fewer still dared to ask. One former blending supervisor only offered the cryptically soothing reply, "It sings in the background, like a bassoon you forgot was there." Of course, this grand symphony of secrecy couldn't exist without the unflagging cooperation of a certain South American nation, Peru. Still the world's top legal coca producer, Peru danced an elegant diplomatic waltz with Coca-Cola and the US government. The Peruvian National Coca Company, yes, that was a real thing, worked with farmers to harvest legally while trying to steer them away from shadier buyers with more exciting nicknames. All the while, Coca-Cola's agents routed their precious leaves through official channels like serene, soda-loving spies. And lest you think this is all shadowy and sinister, remember, the folks doing this work were mostly just trying to finish their shifts and get home in time for reruns. One customs official once quipped that inspecting brick 741-C of botanical specimen declared for beverage use was less of a crime thriller and more of a paperwork opera. By the 1960s, Coca-Cola had quietly become the only company in the United States allowed to import and process coca leaves under federal license. That's right, a one-leaf monopoly. While other soft drink companies fiddled with new artificial flavors and strange slogans, Coke had a lock on an ingredient so unusual it required its own entire regulatory back channel. And yet, with all the fuss and fanfare, the drink itself remained a comforting constant. Millions sipped it at ball games, diners, and hospital waiting rooms, never knowing that, tucked deep beneath layers of chemistry, diplomacy, and three-ring binder documentation, was a flavor lifted from mountain leaves, tenderly handled by lab technicians with steady hands and suspiciously good appetites for fudge. And so, as night settles over the soda fountains and the vials are safely sealed for another day, we draw the curtains on yet another scene in this bubbly intrigue. But just before we drift completely into sleep, one question still simmers lightly beneath the fizz. How long can a secret stay carbonated? As the sun set behind the Georgian hills one final time in our tale, the tired shadows of cola barrels and secrecy began to grow long. Atlanta's hush-hush ingredient story, so wrapped in syrup and suggestion, was coming to its sleepy conclusion. Somewhere around the year when top hats still roamed freely and newspapers had more ads for miracle tonics than actual news, the Coca-Cola company finally faced the inevitable crescendo of the age-old question: what exactly was in the merchandise number 5 inches? By the tail end of the 1920s, Coca-Cola's demand had truly outgrown its quirky, half-secretive roots. What had started as a pharmacist's fizzy fix had now become the go-to beverage of everyone from railroad workers to debutantes. Small-time ingredient smugglers who had once dodged drug laws like alley cats around prohibition agents began to be phased out in favor of something tragically orderly: paperwork. Drab, yawning paperwork. Stepan Company, the mysteriously charming chemical firm that had long played the part of quiet partner in our fizzy fable, was now the only officially licensed entity in the United States allowed to import coca leaves. They even boasted one of the government's oddest business permissions: the ability to bring in narcotic leaves, provided they unnarcotized them first, which they dutifully did in a sleepy factory nestled in Maywood, New Jersey, a place so unassuming even Google Maps occasionally shrugs at it. Each year, thousands of pounds of Peruvian coca leaves made their star-crossed journey, shipped by sea, guarded like they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and eventually arriving in New Jersey, where their illicit charm, namely the cocaine, was carefully extracted by Stepan's pharmacist magicians. The leaves, now charmingly boring, were then sent along to Coca-Cola as an ingredient in the signature flavor compound officially known as, brace yourself for maximum 19th century marketing, merchandise number 5. Sounds more like a missing IKEA part than a secret elixir, but there we have it. Ironically, the government, after decades of pearl clutching and bottle sniffing, ended up being the very entity that ensured these coca leaves could still be legally used in Coke. You see, nothing smooths things over like bureaucracy doing cartwheels through loopholes. Today, it is still technically legal for one company, just the one, to import coca leaves under incredibly strict supervision. The extracted cocaine. That's handed over to the pharmaceutical industry, where it's used for very sterile, less effervescent purposes, like numbing your nose before surgery. And so, under layers of officialdom, vaults of flavoring recipes, and the bored hum of regulatory compliance, Coca-Cola's once daring, eyebrow-raising ingredient settled into a comfortable old age, like a retired spy who now teaches knitting. Of course, the signature recipe is still protected behind several velvet ropes of mystery. Some say it's locked in a vault, others that it's in the hands of just 2 people who are never allowed to fly on the same airplane, which honestly feels more like a plot point from an average Nicolas Cage movie than a beverage security policy. Still, it's oddly comforting to know that while the world changed enormously, while televisions bullied radio out of the living room, while disco rose and fell with glorious sequins swirling, Coca-Cola quietly kept steeping decoconized coca leaves into its mix, a nod to its chaotic beginnings, a carbonated tip of the hat to pharmacists experimenting with wine and coca in the back of the dusty Victorian apothecaries. Now, as horse-drawn wagons give way to electric scooters and secret labs are replaced by sterile compliance facilities, the essence of what made Coca-Cola tick, the blend of zest, legality-dodging genius, and a hint of pharmacological audacity, still bubbles beneath the surface. You may not taste it when you sip a cold bottle, but it's there, somewhere, in the fizz, in the whisper of leaves that once traveled continents under cloak and customs. So tonight, dear listener, As the stars gently blink above the quiet warehouses of Maywood and far-off Peruvian farms rustle in the moonlight, you can smile softly, knowing that the world's most famous fizzy drink began with secrecy, stirred in a little scandal, then settled back into the cradle of sleepy normalcy, and now, comfortably cradled in the arms of history, let it all dissolve. The wagons, the whispers, the bubbling vats, and the mysterious merchandise number 5. Let it fizz gently into dreams, like the last soft pop of a bottle opened in the dusk. Sleep well.